Hey there, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a huge piece of legislation that's been all over the news, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or the OBB Act. This is a law that could potentially reshape huge parts of the American economy, so let's jump in and figure out what's actually in this thing. So what if I told you that just one law could rewrite the rules for your paycheck, your access to healthcare, and the entire country's economic future? Well, that's pretty much the scale we're talking about with the OBBB Act. The potential impact is just massive. You know, with a bill this big and complex, it is super easy to get lost in all the headlines and the political noise. So in this explainer, we're going to cut right through that and give you a clear, simple look at what this law is all about.
All right, so first things first, let's start with a really high-level view. What exactly is the OBB Act when you boil it all down?
It was officially signed into law on July 4th, 2025, and it is a massive piece of federal legislation. It's what's called an omnibus bill, which is basically a fancy term for a law that bundles a ton of smaller, sometimes totally unrelated things into one giant package. And this one, well, it touches everything from taxes and healthcare to food stamps and student loans.
So let's start with the first big piece of this puzzle. It's huge changes to the U.S. tax code. For a lot of us, this is where you're going to feel the impact most directly in your wallet.
Okay, so to really get what's happening here, we've got to rewind a bit to 2017. A huge part of the OBB Act is that it takes the tax cuts from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of that year and makes them permanent. See, a lot of those tax breaks for individuals and businesses were actually temporary and about to expire. This new law locks them in for good.
But it wasn't just about the old stuff. The Act also rolled out a whole slate of brand new and, this is key, temporary tax deductions. So from 2025 through 2028, we're seeing new tax breaks for things like qualified tips, overtime pay, interest on car loans for U.S.-made cars, and even an extra deduction for seniors. The word to remember here, though, is temporary.
Okay, so that's the tax side of things. But honestly, that's only half the story. The OBBB Act is just as big a deal for how it overhauls major social programs. And as you're about to see, this is where the numbers get really, really big.
Let's kick things off with healthcare. The new law is projected to slash federal spending on Medicaid by an estimated $1.2 trillion over the next decade. I mean, just to wrap your head around that number, that is a huge reduction for a program that millions of lower-income Americans rely on for health coverage.
And it doesn't stop with Medicaid. Next up is food assistance. The law makes what sources are calling the biggest cut in history to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. You probably know it as food stamps. We're talking about a cut of $187 billion over 10 years.
Okay, so we're talking about these massive numbers, but what does that actually mean for people? Well, the Non-partisan Congressional Budget Office, they're kind of like the official scorekeeper for new laws. They project that because of these changes, almost 11 million people are going to lose their health insurance.
So you might be wondering, how exactly are these cuts happening? Well, the law basically uses a few key tools to get there. It brings in strict new work requirements for able-bodied adults to get Medicaid, and it expands similar rules for SNAP. Supporters say this is all about encouraging people to be self-sufficient. The bill also makes some big changes to federal student loan repayment plans, affecting who qualifies for things like income-based repayment. Now, these kinds of policy changes, they don't just affect individuals, right? They create ripples across the entire U.S. economy. And analysts are projecting some pretty serious long-term consequences, both for our national debt and for economic growth.
First up, the big one, the national debt. Nonpartisan analysts are projecting that the combination of these permanent tax cuts and the new spending priorities will add over $3 trillion to the national debt in just the next 10 years.
So why does that matter? Well, that massive increase in government borrowing is expected to create a drag on the economy. The theory is something called crowding out. Basically, when the government borrows that much money, it kind of sucks up all the investment capital in the room, leaving less for private businesses to grow and innovate. The projection suggests that by 2054, the U.S. economy could be about 3% smaller than it would have been otherwise.
And when you look at who is affected by all this, the picture gets even clearer. The CBO's analysis shows a really stark difference between income groups. By 2034, the folks in the lowest 10% of earners are projected to see their incomes fall by over 3%. Meanwhile, the highest 10% are projected to see their incomes rise by almost 3%.
And all of this, it really brings us to the absolute heart of the debate around this bill. It's a fundamental question of priorities, really. who wins from a law like this? And who pays the price?
Which leads you to ask a really important question, right? With all these massive cuts to programs like Medicaid and SNAP, where is all that money actually going? How do all of these different pieces connect?
Well, the analysis shows a direct line. The savings from those cuts to social programs are being used to help pay for making those 2017 tax cuts permanent. And those permanent cuts, they overwhelmingly benefit corporations and higher-income folks through things like lower income tax rates and big deductions for business income.
And that trade-off, as you can probably imagine, has drawn some really fierce criticism. Senator Elizabeth Warren summed up the view of the opposition pretty bluntly, calling the bill a betrayal of working people and arguing that it puts tax cuts for the rich ahead of the basic needs of American families.
You know, it's also worth pointing out that these ideas didn't just appear out of thin air. Analysts have highlighted that a lot of what's in the OBBBA Act, things like the work requirements and tax policies, line up really closely with the recommendations from Project 2025. That's a huge governance plan put together by the Heritage Foundation to serve as a blueprint for a potential future conservative administration.
So, where does that leave us? What's the final verdict here? Is this law a bold new engine for economic growth that's designed to get people working and investing? Or, as its harshest critics claim, is it the single largest upward transfer of wealth in American history? Well, as all these different parts of the law start to take effect, the real debate over the legacy of the OBBBA Act is really only just getting started.